Some people avoid love not because they've given up on it, but because they know exactly what it demands. They've seen it up close, its intensity, its exposure, the way it strips away your carefully constructed identity. And they've decided, perhaps unconsciously, that it's safer to stand just outside its reach. For them, love is not a gentle invitation into warmth, but a confrontation with the unbearable. The collapse of distance, the end of performance, and the terrifying possibility of being known. Franz Kafka understood this fear in its purest, most unfiltered form. He didn't fear solitude, he lived in it. He didn't fear desire, he wrote obsessively about it. What he feared was what love would reveal. Not about the other person, but about himself. Because at the heart of Kafka's psychology was a single, haunting belief that if someone got close enough, they wouldn't just see him, they would recoil. And that fear, more than rejection, more than longing, shaped the course of his relationships, his writing, and his worldview. Kafka was twice engaged to Felice Bauer, a woman he wrote to almost compulsively, producing volumes of letters that oscillated between devotion and despair. In those pages, he imagines a life together, only to unravel it days later with doubt, with guilt, with terror. It wasn't Felice he feared. It was the reality of intimacy itself, of being touched, known, inhabited. And so he withdrew, again and again, because love for Kafka was too much proximity, too much vulnerability. It meant being witnessed in a way he could not control. This wasn't mere neurosis, it was existential. Kafka lived in the tension between a craving for connection and a dread of self-erasure. He feared that to truly love was to disappear inside someone else's expectations, that being close meant becoming altered, distorted, consumed. And for a man whose identity felt fragile even in isolation, that was a risk he couldn't take. But Kafka's fear wasn't unique. His is just the clearest, most articulate version of something many people still live today, often without knowing it. In an age that prizes connection yet rewards detachment, the fear of being known runs deep. People swipe, scroll, ghost, and rehearse intimacy through irony and distance, not because they don't care, but because caring is dangerous. Because love still asks the one thing most people haven't learned to give, themselves, unguarded and unedited. Kafka won't teach you how to love. He never figured it out himself. What he offers instead is something more unsettling, but maybe more honest. A mirror. One that reflects not our romantic hopes, but our deepest emotional defenses. The ones that keep us distant, guarded and alone, even when we ache to be otherwise. Kafka's entire emotional life was shaped by a profound ambivalence toward intimacy. He was not loveless. On the contrary, he craved affection, connection, and tenderness so much that it became unbearable. What he feared was not being alone, but what closeness might require him to relinquish. To be in love for Kafka was to place himself in a position where the self, already fragile, already uncertain, could be dissolved under the weight of another's gaze. That fear was not theoretical, it was lived, documented, and encoded in the thousands of letters he sent to the women he tried to love from a distance. The most significant of those women was Felice Bauer, a Berlin secretary whom Kafka met briefly and then pursued, almost entirely through writing. Over 5 years, they exchanged hundreds of letters, often several in a single day, filled with declarations of love, apologies, anxieties, and spiraling monologues. He would propose marriage, then immediately sabotage the proposal with doubt and guilt. He would express deep yearning, only to pull back into despair. It was not indecision, it was a cycle of craving and retreat, intimacy and isolation played out in real time. In one letter, Kafka wrote, "I cannot live with you. I cannot live without you." This was not poetic drama. It was the most honest thing he could say. To be close to Felice meant stepping into a life he could not bear, a domestic life, a physical life, a life of routines and expectations that would leave no room for the solitude and control he needed to function. And yet, to let her go meant confronting the even deeper pain of disconnection, the aching knowledge that his need for love would never find resolution. Kafka's fear of intimacy was inseparable from his sense of self. He saw himself as fundamentally ill-equipped for the demands of human closeness. His physical health was fragile, his confidence minimal, his moods deeply unstable. Love to him meant exposing that instability to someone else, letting another person witness not the writer, not the intellect, but the man beneath, with all his shame, self-hatred, and doubt. That kind of exposure was, for Kafka, a kind of death. And so he lived in avoidance, not by turning away from love, but by staying forever at its edge, close enough to feel its heat, but never close enough to be burned. Writing became the perfect medium for this, a way to reach out while staying protected, to simulate connection without risking the collapse of his interior world. What Kafka feared most wasn't rejection, it was acceptance that would eventually curdle into revulsion. He feared that if someone truly saw him, not his words, not his posture, but the raw, unfiltered self, they would turn away. And rather than face that possibility, he made sure it never happened. Kafka's fear of intimacy wasn't confined to his letters. It leaked into his fiction, transformed into allegory, image, and atmosphere. Nowhere is this more vivid than in the Metamorphosis, his most iconic and psychologically revealing work. On the surface, it tells the story of Gregor Samsa, a traveling salesman who wakes up one morning transformed into a giant insect. It's a surreal premise, almost absurd. But Kafka doesn't treat it with irony. He treats it with quiet horror. There is no grand moment of panic, no scream into the void. Gregor simply awakens to his new condition and begins, slowly, to realize what it means. Not just that his life is over, but that he has become unspeakable to those who once loved him. What Gregor experiences is not just physical alienation, it is the collapse of relational identity. His family, at first shocked, attempts to care for him, but it doesn't last. As time passes, their sympathy turns to revulsion. He becomes a burden, an embarrassment, something to be hidden away. His presence in the household becomes intolerable, not because he's dangerous, but because he's no longer comprehensible. And this is where Kafka's psychological insight cuts deepest. Gregor's transformation is not what drives the family away. It's what reveals what was already there. In Kafka's hands, the grotesque isn't a monster, it's a mirror. Gregor becomes what many fear they already are beneath their carefully maintained lives: unlovable, unacceptable, a source of shame. His transformation is a metaphor for what it feels like to be exposed in love, to be seen not at your best, but at your weakest, your ugliest, your most dependent. And the chilling message isn't just that others might abandon you, it's that they might do it silently, gradually, as affection erodes into obligation and presence becomes a problem to be solved. Kafka wasn't inventing a nightmare. He was documenting a familiar emotional sequence, the quiet terror that to be fully known is to be quietly rejected. Not in a single dramatic rupture, but in a slow fade, a turning away, a tired silence. This is the fear that paralyzes many people who long for intimacy but never fully step into it. The suspicion that love cannot survive the truth. Gregor's story ends in quiet tragedy. Isolated in his room, unable to speak or connect, he dies not from injury, but from the withering absence of love. And in that moment, Kafka articulates something most literature about love avoids, that the real danger isn't abandonment, it's conditional acceptance. Love that only exists as long as you're convenient, charming, whole. The moment you falter, it begins to die. For Kafka, writing was not merely an artistic vocation. It was a shelter, a medium through which he could reach toward love while maintaining the distance necessary to survive it. In life, he struggled with closeness. In letters, he was fearless. He confessed, obsessed, spiraled, and exposed himself with an honesty that few people can sustain face to face. But this openness was only possible because it was contained, because it happened through the page. In this way, writing became his greatest emotional technology, both a tool for connection and a structure of defense. In his letters to Felice and later to Milena Jasenska, we see this dual impulse in constant motion. On one hand, he writes with incredible intimacy. He lays bare his fears, his needs, his physical and mental suffering. He admits again and again that he is unfit for ordinary life, that the idea of marriage terrifies him, that he cannot balance his inner world with the demands of shared living. And yet, these confessions are not meant to push the other away. In a strange sense, they draw them closer. The more he reveals his brokenness, the more bound to him they become, through sympathy, through hope, through a desire to help. But what's crucial is that all of this unfolds in absence. Kafka rarely allowed these women to meet the embodied version of himself, the one who stammered, who panicked, who withdrew. The Kafka of letters was coherent, expressive, and bold. The Kafka of presence was frightened and elusive. The contradiction wasn't a deception. It was a survival strategy. On paper, he could control the pace, the framing, the rhythm of exposure. In person, none of that was possible. In person, he was too vulnerable. This pattern reveals something essential about how Kafka understood love, not as a space of mutual unfolding, but as a kind of dangerous light. To love someone was to step into their gaze, and to be in their gaze was to risk disintegration. So he kept love at the safest possible distance, intimate but unreachable, passionate but indirect. And this isn't just a personal oddity. It's a dynamic that still persists today, though it now takes different forms. Emotional intimacy is often simulated through text, through digital threads of communication that allow for curation, for delay, for the softening of disclosure. Like Kafka, many people today can express enormous emotional depth through writing, through texting, through voice notes, but struggle to inhabit the same honesty face to face. Because digital space, like Kafka's letters, allows us to manage vulnerability, to test the waters without diving in, to protect the self while appearing open. Kafka was perhaps the earliest literary witness to this impulse. The desire to be known without risking dissolution, to be emotionally present without being physically exposed. He didn't romanticize it, he suffered under it, but he understood its logic, and in documenting it, he anticipated an entire structure of modern intimacy that would emerge long after his death. In this light, his fear becomes less about one man's neurosis and more about a broader human condition, the impossible wish to be loved without ever being seen too clearly, the hope that someone might cherish us as we are, without having to meet the parts of us we can barely accept ourselves. Kafka never claimed to offer wisdom. He wasn't a moralist, and he certainly wasn't a guide. His life was filled with contradiction, paralysis, and emotional exhaustion. And yet, the patterns he laid bare, first in his private relationships, then in his fiction, have become psychological blueprints for the modern condition. He showed what it looks like when a person's need for love is equally matched by their fear of it, when longing is constantly undermined by shame, and when emotional intimacy becomes indistinguishable from personal danger. What Kafka feared wasn't unique to his era, and it's not a relic of it either. If anything, his emotional landscape has become more familiar, not less. Today, we have more access to each other than ever before, yet vulnerability still feels like the one risk we're not willing to take. We speak of authenticity, of connection, of being seen, but much of that remains performative. The deep kind of intimacy, the kind that Kafka feared, is still avoided, because it still hurts, because it still threatens the internal structures we've spent years constructing to feel stable. In Kafka's view, love wasn't dangerous because people were cruel. It was dangerous because people were inconsistent, because affection fades, because understanding is conditional, because what one person sees as beauty, another might come to resent. This is the emotional logic of someone who cannot afford to gamble with connection, not because he doesn't value it, but because he values it too much to survive its loss. It's easy to say that Kafka was overly sensitive, that his wounds were his own. But that misses the deeper relevance of his work. Because he wasn't only describing his own terror, he was diagnosing something structural. The way love, when filtered through insecurity, can feel indistinguishable from exposure. The way attachment can feel less like comfort and more like a mirror that reflects everything we hope to keep hidden. That's why Kafka's stories remain so unsettling. They aren't romantic tragedies in the traditional sense, they're slow implosions. They depict what happens when love becomes unbearable, not because it's absent, but because it's too present, too invasive, too honest. And so, even when it arrives, it must be sabotaged. Many people today live in that same contradiction. They want love, They even chase it, but when it draws near, when it becomes real, they shrink. Not because they don't feel, but because they fear being seen in a way they can't manage. They fear being known in the same way Kafka feared being known, not just as a person, but as a problem, as a burden, as someone whose truth will eventually wear out the affection that first welcomed it. Kafka's life was not a warning against love itself. It was a warning about what happens when the self becomes so fragile, so tangled in guilt and shame, that love becomes unlivable. And in that warning is a strange kind of gift, not advice, not a path forward, but a recognition, a way of saying, if this fear lives in you, you're not the first. Kafka doesn't offer resolution, he doesn't give us redemption arcs or grand breakthroughs. There is no catharsis, no narrative triumph. What he offers instead is something harder to accept, but maybe more necessary, a mirror. Not the kind you look into for comfort, but the kind that shows you what you've been avoiding, the parts of yourself you've disowned, the fears you've tried to intellectualize, the quiet belief that if someone truly saw you, not your image, but your raw, unpolished self, they might not stay. This is where Kafka's real value lies, not in his suffering, not in his isolation, but in his precision. He names the unspoken terms beneath our desire for love, the fear that love to be real must reveal, and the fear that once revealed, we will no longer be wanted. That is the fear that lives at the core of so many modern relationships, not a fear of commitment, as we often say, but a fear of exposure, of being known too fully, of being understood too well. And Kafka, with all his panic and guilt and retreat, gives form to that fear. He does not resolve it, he doesn't overcome it, but he lets us see it clearly. And sometimes, clarity is the only place we can start. If you recognize yourself in Kafka, not in his words, but in his avoidance, his retreat, his endless emotional rehearsal, then know this: you're not alone. The fear of being seen is ancient, it's woven into the human condition, but being aware of it is already something. It means you've noticed the distance, you've named the defense, and naming it slowly is how it begins to lose its power. Kafka didn't know how to love without fear, but in naming the fear, he showed the rest of us where the work begins. If this resonated with you, if you've ever found yourself retreating just when love gets close, consider subscribing. We explore the minds of writers and thinkers like Kafka, not to romanticize their pain, but to understand the architecture of our own.